Fire cannot kill a dragon. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is The Advocate, and today I'm an advocate for Fire and Blood, a book review. Fire and Blood, written by George R.R. Martin, was released on November 20, 2018, and serves as the inspiration for the currently airing House of the Dragon TV show. How does this book compare to George R.R. Martin's other works within the A Song of Ice and Fire series? Well, before we answer that question, I do want to spend some time to discuss this book's publication history because, boy oh boy, I think it's safe to say that Fire and Blood might be the most divisive book within the A Song of Ice and Fire series. You see, back in 2017, just before Fire and Blood was about to be announced, there was a lot of hype and anticipation for the yet-to-be-released, eagerly anticipated 6th book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series, The Winds of Winter, a book we are unfortunately still waiting for to this day. And although fans at the time did have Game of Thrones to look forward to, the TV show, the then-at-the-time released 7th season was garnering a mixed reception, to say the least. Although by season 7, George was no longer involved with the writing of the TV show, many viewers still flocked to George's inbox to ask what his thoughts were on the show's consistently worrying writing decisions, especially with how it pertained to potential material that had yet to be released in George's books. George stayed relatively mum about the whole thing, however, he would reiterate that the show and the books were two completely separate canons, and those looking forward to what his vision was for the series should look no further than the soon-to-be-released The Winds of Winter. Well, surprise, not surprise. Rather than getting a long-anticipated blog post from George with regards to an announcement for the release of The Winds of Winter, fans in 2017 instead got an announcement for a book that not many expected or necessarily asked for. A Targaryen history book that recounts the genealogy and various successions of the Targaryen family going back 300 years prior to the events of the main A Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones series, and people were not pleased. As you can imagine, there was a lot of vitriol and anger immediately directed towards George due to the fact that this was not The Winds of Winter. Up to this point, and something still true to this day, Winds had seen delay after delay after delay, with George repeatedly promising that the book would be released soon, but soon has yet to come. Now, I'm not here to tear into George or anything like that, as the man can write whatever he wants. If George is more interested in writing a history book than another iteration in his humongously complex series, then that's more than his right to do that. He's not obligated to write Winds. However, I, as a fan, can definitely understand why many people were super pissed off back then. But there was nothing the fans could do. The damage was done. When release day finally came for Fire and Blood, all fans could do was read the book, look forward to the final season of Game of Thrones and hope it didn't stink up the joint, and continue to wait for the long-fabled The Winds of Winter. So, that was then. However, today, now that we are several years removed from the anger that this book wasn't The Winds of Winter, does Fire and Blood still have the stigma of a book that was unnecessary? Or does it perhaps merit a read-through, especially now that we're in the midst of House of the Dragon hype? Well, before we answer those questions, if you could do me a huge favor and hit that like button, drop a comment down below, and consider subscribing to my channel, as it really does help me in overcoming the evil Vagar-sized dragon that is the YouTube algorithm. Additionally, as a heads up, this video will be split into 3 parts. Part 1 will focus on my spoiler-free thoughts on Fire and Blood and will not contain any spoilers with regards to the House of the Dragon TV show. Part 2 will focus on book spoilers, but only for material that has already aired on the House of the Dragon TV show. And Part 3 will be spoilers everything, which includes spoilers for the entire Fire and Blood book and spoilers for material that is yet to air. Timestamps have been provided below. Let's do this thing! Alright guys, I'm just gonna come right out and say it. If you have not read the main A Song of Ice and Fire series or watched the Game of Thrones TV show, then you're probably not going to like this book. Fire and Blood serves as a quasi-prequel to the main A Song of Ice and Fire series, and the book expands on a lot of historical lore that was only lightly touched on in the main series. This includes a barrage of names, houses, families, kingdoms, cultures, and without a baseline understanding of these different elements, I don't think someone will really enjoy this book. On top of that, this book is written like a dry history textbook, which is not exactly new reader friendly. All this to say, if you're someone who has never read A Song of Ice and Fire book but wants to check out Fire and Blood, I would say your best bet is actually to read the original Game of Thrones book and then come back to Fire and Blood at a later point in time once you've completed the first 5 books in the main A Song of Ice and Fire series. As for seasoned fans, I think you'll like this book. But only if you're passionate about the pre-existing lore that exists within the main series. This is a book that is lore first and characters second. Unlike the main series where you really get to know the characters through their point of view perspectives and delve into their mind and subconscious, this book is written from an omniscient point of view that is detached from the characters. Now, occasionally you will read bits and pieces of dialogue that are spliced into the main narrative which allow the reader to have a better understanding as to who that character is. However, the book's predominant focus is recounting the historically significant events that occurred during Targaryen rule and not much else. If that does not sound like your cup of tea, then you're probably not going to like this book. Now, one of the unique aspects about Fire and Blood that is absent from the main series is the artwork that is included in the hardcover and traditional paperback versions of Fire and Blood. There are some beautifully drawn illustrations here that not only help to visually enrich key scenes, but also help to compensate for what can occasionally be a rather dry read. Now, unfortunately for me, these illustrations are sadly not included in the American mass market paperback edition of the book, but if you have the traditional paperback or the hardcover version, then you should be covered. Now, if you're more of a listener than a reader, then the Fire and Blood audiobook does come with a PDF attachment that contains all of the artwork that is included in the book's hardcover version. However, that artwork does not pop up as you're listening to the story, so you'll actually have to navigate to the PDF and search for each illustration as the book is being narrated. It's rather cumbersome to say the least. Now, moving on to the actual content of this book, the story of Fire and Blood starts roughly about 302 years prior to the events of A Game of Thrones and takes place over a 138-year time period that spans the time between Aegon's conquest of Westeros all the way up to the end of Aegon III's regency. If you want to know what happens after Aegon III's regency, well, you're gonna have to wait a while because as of this recording, the follow-up Fire and Blood 2, or Blood and Fire as George likes to call it, has yet to be released. Oh, George. Now, if you're someone who watches the House of the Dragon TV show and only wants to read the source material that is encompassed within the show, then the Dance of the Dragons chapters in the second half of this book, starting with the Heirs of the Dragon, A Question of Succession chapter, is what you're looking for. The material from the first half of this book has yet to be adapted, although there are rumors that an Aegon's Conquest TV show is in the works. However, we'll see soon enough if that's true. Regardless, if you're a super fan of everything Westerosi, but for some reason have yet to pick this book up, then I think you may be a little disappointed with how familiar some of this material will read. Because 40% of this book is actually copy-pasted from a different history compendium altogether, George R.R. Martin's The World of Ice and Fire. There's a ton of new material here that is woven in or expands on the already pre-existing material from The World of Ice and Fire, but there's also a lot of overlap that requires mentioning. Now, I'm not sure if the World of Ice and Fire includes this, but something that I'm very grateful for the inclusion of in Fire and Blood is this Targaryen family tree close to the back of the book. Because as I'm sure you all know by now, the Targaryens sure do love their incest, and keeping track of their incestuous relationships and the children they have and who marries who is a little bit difficult to keep track of. Now, moving on to the way this book is written. Although this book's historical style did take some growing on me, one thing that I absolutely did love about that style was the method in which the history was accessed, mainly through the storytelling device of an unreliable narrator. George makes the interesting decision to have historically significant events that take place within this story be told through the perspective of various narrators who may or may not be telling the whole truth, and I love that. Now, I have not read J.R.R. Tolkien's Silmarillion, the historical compendium for The Lord of the Rings, and I'm sure if I sat down and read that book, I would very much enjoy it as well. However, if I were to compare that book, where J.R.R. Tolkien just pretty much tells you the story of Middle-earth straight as it happened, with the storytelling device present here in Fire and Blood, I think I prefer the way George R.R. Martin tells the history here when compared to that one, in my opinion, as the multiple unreliable narrators kind of create this neat little puzzle element for the reader to try to piece together what actually happened in the story based on these sometimes contradictory accounts.
And here we must digress to say a word about our sources. For much of what happened in the years that followed happened behind closed doors, in the privacy of stairwells, council rooms, and bedchambers, and the full truth of it will likely never be known. We have, of course, the chronicles laid down by Grand Maester Runsitter and his successors, and many a court document as well, all the royal decrees and proclamations, but these tell only a small part of the story. For the rest, we must look to accounts written decades later by the children and grandchildren of those caught up in the events of these times, lords and knights reporting events witnessed by their forebears, third-hand recollections of aged serving men relating the scandals of their youth. Whilst these are undoubtedly of use, so much time passed between the event and the recording that many confusions and contradictions have inevitably crept in, nor do these remembrances always agree.
Not to mention that the story being told through these multiple conflicting sources whose truth comes into question is a very perfect reflection of our history here in the real world. If we look back on real-life events from centuries ago that hinge on eyewitness testimonies, we're going to find some inaccuracies. George has a lot of fun with this storytelling style, particularly in the second half of this book with the Dance of the Dragon's War, and we'll cover that in the spoiler section. Now, when it comes to prequels, there is a temptation by many writers to use those stories as an opportunity to provide fan service for the readers. Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with a little fan service to warm our nostalgic hearts, but when an author overly relies on fan service purely for the sake of making the reader reminisce on old material, then it makes the current material feel rather cheap by comparison. Fire and Blood, however, doesn't really have this problem, as although there are some occasional flashbacks here, or flash forwards to specific events from the main A Song of Ice and Fire series, George never really gets indulgent with these callbacks. A perfect example of this is one of the prophecies that is mentioned a couple of times in one of the later chapters in the book.
And talk was heard in camp of a prophecy of ancient days that said, "When the hammer shall fall upon the dragon, a new king shall arise, and none shall stand before him."
Of course, as fans of the main series, we know who this prophecy is referring to, but a lesser author might take the time to hammer home, pun intended, that one day a man named Robert Baratheon who beholds the stag will drop a mighty hammer on his enemies and will be crowned king. And that would totally ruin the flow of the story. George, on the other hand, thankfully only just provides a small Easter egg for fans to smile at, and then quickly moves on to the actual story. It's neat and effective. Now, obviously, I came into this book knowing it was going to be written like a dry history textbook, and for the most part I didn't mind it, as I very much enjoy the Targaryen history and find it to be more interesting than our very real-life history. But the one thing that did really start to drag for me, especially in the later parts of the book, was all the scheming. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous and crazy because this is the A Song of Ice and Fire series, a book series that is known for its scheming and political intrigue, but there's just so much scheming that happens within this book that by the end of it, it just starts to become draining. I start to get a little fatigued, and I see the pattern of just like how real-life history repeats itself, so does Targaryen history, as you can never have a moment of true peace, as there's always players in the background that are trying to scheme their way to the top, and it just starts to wear on my patience there close to the end of the book. But that aside, I must have been the correct demographic for this book because I very much enjoyed Fire and Blood. And if you've read the main series and have read everything else within George R.R. Martin's catalog, but for some reason have not picked this book up yet, I think you owe it to yourself to at least check out Fire and Blood and see if it's up your alley, despite its dry storytelling style. So I think that pretty much covers everything I wanted to talk about that's spoiler-free. So if you're caught up with the most recent episode of House of the Dragon and have read Fire and Blood, then I think now's as good a time as ever to move on to some spoilers. So obviously the most talked about aspect about Fire and Blood is the Dance of the Dragon's War, which is featured in the second half of this book and serves as the source material for the House of the Dragon TV show. However, while HBO likely chose to adapt that material first based on the perception of it being the most appealing to the general masses, I believe they missed an opportunity by not adapting the content from the first half of this book, as there are a lot of intriguing events that happen here that I think deserve attention. Aegon's conquest of Westeros, the turmoil that follows Aegon's death, Maegor the Cruel sitting himself as king, pretty much all the bad stuff that happens during Maegor's rule, some fantastic dragon battles. There's even a poignant moment in the first half of this book that has Red Wedding vibes written all over it, which would have made for some fantastic TV.
In 45 AC, construction finally came to an end on the Red Keep. King Maegor celebrated its completion by feasting the builders and workmen who had labored on the castle, sending them wagon loads of strong wine and sweet meats, and whores from the city's finest brothels. The revels lasted for 3 days. Afterward, the king's knights moved in and put all the workmen to the sword, to prevent them from ever revealing the Red Keep's secrets. Their bones were interred beneath the castle that they had built. All this to say, this book has some fantastic and horrifying sequences all throughout this story, not just within the Dance of the Dragon's War. Now, if you're someone who hasn't read Fire and Blood, but are looking forward to reading the book after watching the House of the Dragon TV show, I think there are some things you should be wary of prior to reading this book. For starters, as I mentioned earlier, this book consists of multiple different testimonies who each tell an occasionally scandalously different version of events that take place within the story. And there is no, this is exactly how it happened, as it's more or less a bunch of, it could have happened like this. And part of the fun is taking these multiple conflicting testimonies and trying to decipher the truth that lies somewhere in the middle. Similarly, the House of the Dragon's version of events, although not perfect and even changing and adding a few things that neither witness chronicles within the book, also tries to decipher the opposing testimonies of Grand Maester Munkin, Septon Eustace, and King Viserys' faithful fool Mushroom's version of events, and either completely sides with one of the testimonies or comes up with its own version of events. Examples of this include the show leaning more heavily on Mushroom's version of events when recounting Rhaenyra's moment of burgeoning womanhood, or the show taking bits and pieces from each testimony on the Eric Cargill versus Arik Cargill duel to come up with its own version of events. Another thing to keep in mind for show watchers who are first-time book readers is that similar to Game of Thrones, which started deviating further and further away from the source material with each passing season, House of the Dragon has also started kind of taking a few liberties here and there with the source material that I think are going to continue with each passing season. Now, a few of these changes don't really affect the story in a dramatic fashion, such as Alicent being the same age as Rhaenyra in the show as opposed to being 11 years older than Rhaenyra in the book, or even the show's very divisive decision to remove Maelor Targaryen as one of Helena's children, as the Blood and Cheese sequence still accomplishes its goal of igniting the Greens to war, despite the, in my opinion, less effective scene. However, there have been a few changes that the show has made that have major ramifications for this story and are nowhere to be seen within the book. These include, Alicent is much more sympathetic in the show, as in the book it is strongly hinted she is the one who killed King Viserys and was one of the key instigators in starting the war. The dragons in the show seem to be more animalistic and have a mind of their own, hence Lucerys Valyrian's death via Aemon's Vhagar being more accidental rather than purposeful. Rhaena Targaryen is not the one who claims sheep stealer, but rather a young common-born girl named Nettles, which will affect the story for how it differs from the books down the line. And biggest of all, the books make no mention whatsoever of Aegon the Conqueror's reasoning for coming to Westeros being because he was a proponent of the Prince that was promised prophecy. Him having a dream that told him that an army of the dead would come south of the wall to kill everyone, and the only way to stop this invasion is to have a Targaryen sit the Iron Throne, is, as of now, a show-only plot point. But despite these changes, I think show watchers should still be able to catch on to everything else going on within the book, and may even come up with their own version of events that's different from both the book and the show. My only recommendation would be to start reading from the very beginning of the Dance of the Dragon's War at the Heirs of the Dragon chapter, as opposed to where the show leaves off, as by Season 2, a lot of character motivations have diverged from where they were in the book, and it just makes more sense to start from the beginning.
Now, to circle back to the various witnesses who occasionally tell wildly different stories of the same key events, I gotta say that my favorite testimony has to easily be Mushroom's version of events. Now, the best way I can describe Mushroom is if he hypothetically were to exist in our very real world and were to have witnessed the assassination of John F. Kennedy, he would be the guy who would years later come up with a story about how he held JFK in his arms as he died and then comforted his wife by holding her hand and letting her know that he would avenge her husband by confronting whoever did this to JFK. Yeah, that's Mushroom. I love Mushroom. Narratively speaking, Mushroom's purpose is to counterbalance Septon Eustace's Team Green bias, as Mushroom is quite fond of Team Black. But functionally speaking, Mushroom provides some much-needed comic levity to what can occasionally be a dry and wearisome read. Our faithful dwarf consistently self-inserts himself into the story's most important events, occasionally referencing his own anatomical member, and it's such a laugh to read about.
From there, the prince went on to show his niece how best to touch a man to bring him pleasure, an exercise that sometimes involved Mushroom himself and his alleged enormous member. After the loss of his fingers, Viserys I never sat upon the Iron Throne again. Thereafter he shunned the throne room, preferring to hold court in his solar and later in his bedchamber, surrounded by maesters, septons, and his faithful fool Mushroom, the only man who could still make him laugh. Says Mushroom. "Only I could lighten her grace's heart," Mushroom claims in his testimony. "In this dark hour, I became the queen's counselor, setting aside my fool's scepter and pointed hat to lend her all my wisdom and compassion. Unbeknownst to all, it was the jester who ruled them now, an invisible king in motley."
Is Mushroom telling the truth? Well, that's part of the fun, delving through Mushroom's self-insert fanfiction and getting to the truth of his more depraved version of events, even though the King's Landing high folk may not want to believe in the potential truth of his more salacious account. It's such a fun ride. Now, before we wrap up this book review, there's just a few small spoiler things I want to address. So if you haven't read until the end of the book or don't want to know what happens in the future of House of the Dragon, then skip ahead to the end of this video because I'm going full spoilers. So most readers will tell you that the Dance of the Dragon's War is the best part about Fire and Blood. And although I also greatly enjoyed this book's first half, I tend to concur that yes, the dance is probably the book's strongest point. However, once the dance ends and Aegon III, spoilers, ascends the Iron Throne, rather than ending the book at its natural conclusion, George R.R. Martin instead continues the story by detailing additional chapters worth of, in my subjective opinion, irrelevant and not as interesting information about outside parties trying to undermine Aegon III. Now, it could just be me feeling fatigue after all the scheming that occurred during the dance, but all of Unwin Peake's shenanigans during the last few chapters of this book really just pale in comparison to anything Criston Cole or Daemon Targaryen did, that it just kind of feels like an anticlimax, and I really do think we could have done without it. But I guess if George truly did want to detail all the events that occurred during Aegon III's regency, then I think it would have made more sense to tie in Aegon's 16th birthday with him reuniting with his long-lost brother, the young Viserys, as this heartwarming moment provides another quasi-natural event to end the book on. However, once more, George R.R. Martin does not end the story here, but instead continues again, this time by detailing some irrelevant political information about the implosion of Lys, and I just don't care. That sounds cruel, but Lys has such little bearing on the going-ons of King's Landing that I'm just past the point of George, please end this book. But despite this book's rather limp ending, I still very much enjoyed my time with Fire and Blood, and I'm very much looking forward to finding out what happens next in Blood and Fire. So all in all, Fire and Blood is a good book. But there's definitely some qualifiers here. If you're a huge fan of the A Song of Ice and Fire series, are interested in the lore, have not read The World of Ice and Fire, and don't mind a dry history retelling, then I think you'll like this book as the history is rather interesting. However, if any of those things do apply to you, then just be warned that this book might not be your cup of tea. If you made it this far, thank you so very much for watching my video, guys. I truly do appreciate it. Thank you so much. Stay tuned for more Song of Ice and Fire related videos and book videos in general. I got you guys covered for months to come. Until next time, The Advocate, out.